So yeah, thanks, Paul, for the invitation, and it's a real honor to be here in Cambridge. I've been here a few times, but like I think 20 years ago now. So it's lovely to be back. I'm going to start just briefly, and Paul touched on it. So I looked at the program, and there's a lot of interventionists in this room. A lot of people doing really interesting interventions and really interested in how to make things better for children. So I thought I'd just give some of my credentials briefly, because I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about something different, but to give a sense of some of the work I've done. I started out as an infant mental health person. I loved attachment theory, did my PhD in attachment theory, infant mental health, have 2 long-term cohorts of children in longitudinal intervention cohorts, one of 18 years, another of 12 years thus far. We've just been funded to follow them now at 13 and 15. And look at brain phenotypes of resilience. So as those cohorts have grown older, I've then become more interested in child and adolescent mental health. And all that, and also more recently done some work funded by the Lego Foundation, which I think is appropriate here. Currently working on developing a parenting app that'll be tested RCT next year in Tanzania. And Jill's in the room somewhere. You'll be glad to know we also got some money from the Global Parenting Initiative through Lego to do some work on using machine learning to code interactions between mothers and babies and young children. Because anyone in this room, as I did, has spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours watching interactions. You know it's fascinating and it nearly pushes you over the edge. And so if we get a machine to do that, that'll be amazing. We've just had our first paper accepted in an engineering computer science journal. So we're making tiny little bits of steps of progress there. And as Paul said, I've currently doing work in Chennai, Nairobi, and ironically even in Seattle, because there's suddenly a shift that we're actually now starting to import interventions from Africa to the US and Sweden, for example, which I think is simply a lovely thing. But what I want to talk about is this term, and the first time I heard about it was in this UNICEF document from earlier this year. And it's this term called, and it's often said apolycrisis, which is this interconnected web of near simultaneous adversities manifesting interdependently in a globalized world. There's a recent article published about saying that actually we shouldn't say a polycrisis, we should say right now we're in the polycrisis. This is it. This is the tipping point. The pandemic showed it, climate breakdown showed it, that if we don't do something urgently and shift the paradigm, we're in trouble. So, and there are many of them, and COVID obviously was one of them, and we're still feeling the after effects of that. But increasingly, urbanization. Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, currently has 7 million people. It's estimated that by 2070 it'll be 70 million people. So 70 million versus 7 in a very short period of time. The implications for children are profound. All of us know about what's happening with climate breakdown. And so I'm going to put those there as things we know a lot about, and I want to use what's happening in artificial intelligence and robots as a metaphor for what I want to say about play. So I don't know if this is going to work. First time I've done this, but I'm going to try. So a lot of this thinking arose out of a commission that I was part of called The Future for the World's Children. And really it was our attempt with a whole number of commissioners, the WHO, UNICEF, to make an argument that children should be put at the center, not of children's policies only, but of all policies. And literally, we meant all policies. So that when the roads department decides to build a road, it's not just about, are you managing to get the trucks that carry the goods to make money for the industrialists from A to B? Of course, that's important. We need taxes, we need that to happen. But actually, it's also about how to link communities together. It's about how to get more vulnerable people to the healthcare settings, primary healthcare clinics, which in the context I work in is a massive issue. It's about how do you keep children safe. In Cape Town where I live, the largest killer of children aged 5 to 9 is pedestrian car accidents. And that's in a place where children are dying for lots of reasons. So it's a massively important issue. So that's where we made this case. And we argued that this is an emergency, and this is what I want to talk about, that a paradigm shift is utterly vital. And I found this interesting, this quote, because obviously this was written at the time of sort of between the two wars and what is happening in the world. And I think we're at a similar kind of point now. That if we don't do something different, and it cannot be the same old way of thinking that we've been doing up until now. So, as I said, I'm going to use artificial intelligence as the metaphor, as it were. Does anybody know about the paperclip metaphor that was used by Nick Bostrom? Any hands? Okay, so Nick Bostrom is a guy writing years ago, he wrote this, and it was about what happens if you had an artificial entity that was so powerful. Would you know that if you gave it an instruction, that instruction would be to the benefit of all humanity? And he used the paperclip as an example. So if you asked it to make the best and make the most paperclips you could possibly imagine, and that was its task, if you didn't build in, by the way, keep human beings alive to make your paperclips, you could end up causing a lot of problems. So be careful what you give the order to if you don't build in another kind of safety mechanism, another kind of mind or brain in that artificial intelligence, because you might not know where that goes. And he called that, I think it was called the alignment problem. Be careful what you're designing for. This is the most wonderful novella for anyone, and Alison Gopnik, who I'll talk about more later, described this as the best novella on parenting that she'd ever read. And I agree. And essentially, it's about people caring for what are called digients, which are digital entities. And the book then, that these digital entities play, they grow up, and when they get into the adolescence, they deal with issues of now independence. How do you allow them to do certain things and not others? What happens if they disagree with you? What happens if they don't like you very much and they want to move away? And all of this is done using these digients as the model. And I think it's a profound meditation, I think, on parenting, and I will come back to it as well. Now, I want to move slightly to play and thinking and what a child mind does. So any of you who've seen the documentaries recently or know anything about octopi, they're quite amazing because they actually have 9 brains. They have a central brain, and then they have a brain in each one of their legs. And what the brain in the legs does is that they go wildly and explore. They're curious. They find stuff out. They're touching things all the time. But they're entirely independent, each one of them, and they're gathering information. And Alison Gopnik describes that as that's what children do when they play. Young children are utterly curious. They're utterly uninhibited. They're exploring like those arms. What the central brain does, it takes all that sensory information and it makes some sense of it. It organizes it. It does the planning that's needed. And so you could imagine a metaphor where children are those arms, and as you grow into adulthood, you have the central part that now, you've got to be a bit more disciplined. You've got to wake up at a certain time. You do have to get dressed when you go out to school. And all those kinds of things that we see as important. I think what's happened, and another way of looking at it as well, is a sort of this spotlight versus the lantern of attention. So what happens with the lantern is that's what we do as adults. We tend to focus down and we narrow down. In our disciplines, we narrow down even more narrowly into specific, you don't even get an ear, nose, and throat doctor anymore. You got the ear, the nose, and the throat. So we specialize down. And what I think we've done, and this is where part of the paradigm shift is needed, is we've lost that capacity as well as adults to do a little bit more of that exploring, of that uninhibited exploration. We've come down to narrow things down in very specific forms of specific types of attention, because that's what our economy needs and demands. And it's a very specific type of cognitive focus, cognitive development that we have to, that in some ways is what is needed in the economy right now. But is it a given? So what kinds of brains might we need in the future Right now, the brain we need has been very specifically, and particularly I'm thinking here, North America, Europe, a very particular kind of brain with very particular kinds of skills that an education system has sort of developed for us. I was part of the developing of something called the Nurture and Care Framework. I was one of the coordinating writers of it, which is a WHO document which made the case for the first 3 years of life. You know, the first 1,000 days, but pushed it to 3 years, and made the case that responsive caregiving, early learning are key foundational, and it took all the science that I'm sure all of you in the room are well aware of to make this case. I think what we need more of in the future is the kinds of brains that responsive caregiving, deep embedded connectedness and relationships with caregivers and children. We don't need to not do that, and we've seen recently the shift in terms of early child development after COVID back to a more kind of like survive for understandable reasons, and we risk losing some of that focus. So specifically about play. I'm a fan, for many of you who don't know David Graeber. He was an anthropologist, bit of an anarchist, I think, and he died a number of years ago. And one of the things he wrote, which I love, is that play is the ultimate expression of freedom for its own sake. And that's key, absolutely key in play, that there's no goal, that it's the thing you're doing when you're not working. According to Alison Gopnik as well, it's useless. Now, we know it's not useless in a very particular way. We know how important it is. But it doesn't provide any economic benefit. It doesn't provide any intellectual benefit for other people. In that sense, it's useless. But it's useless on purpose and for a very particular reason. And she argued that pretend play is probably the most important, sophisticated characteristic of our human abilities. Not all animals, many animals play, and often play quite sophisticated, in a sophisticated way. We're not the only ones, but it's a very particular form of human endeavor. And very importantly, and this is where I'll make the link back to artificial intelligence, is it's not goal-directed. So all of you that have been fiddling around and playing with large language models and ChatGPT 3, and it's 4, may even be 5 now, I can't keep up, is that they fundamentally designed to optimize goals. Okay, somebody said quite recently that it's less artificial intelligence than it's like a thermostat, which takes all the information it's got and goes up and goes down, the temperature. It's actually not very intelligent at all. It's just taking trillions and trillions and trillions of words and knows which order they're in. But it's very much about a particular goal. So it's brilliant at that. But in fact, it may not be brilliant at many other things. And that for me feels key. Because right now our young people, adolescents, certainly in my experience, the ones that I work with, are really worried. They're worried about there not being jobs for them, that these will be taken by AI, by computers, by ChatGPT or whatever comes next. Alison Gopnik and others have said, however, that if robots, and this is why Ted Chiang's book is so lovely, is that it shows the development over time. That if you want to get better at things that aren't simply about a goal at the end, a very specific, narrow goal, like these models are right now, you'd better get robots to learn to play across time. So free play. What's key about free play, for example, and this is not parental directed play. This is allowing children to completely freely roam and play themselves, which increasingly in many high-income countries, and certainly in countries like mine, where violence and danger are a serious issue, is children are not being allowed to do this. It is illegal. I don't know if it's in the UK or certainly in the States, where in certain parts of countries, it's illegal for a child in a playground to be playing, if they're under 9, it's now been changed in some states, I think it's the United States, under 12, unless they're supervised. In a park, not in a forest, not in a dangerous downtown, in a play park. They're not allowed to do it without parental. We are boxing our children in because of a fear of somehow they're going to get kidnapped, they're going to be in danger. And there's no high-income country right now in the world where children are not safer right now than they were 20 years ago. Nowhere. There might be selected spots where it's true, but children are safer than ever, and we're allowing them to roam less than we ever do. And we can talk about all the reasons for that. But what's so vital about pretend play is, unlike a structured game, if you're playing football or you're playing cricket, there are specific rules, often imposed by the rule, but imposed by adults as well and parents. And this is how you do it. And if you do this, this is the response. In free play, there's none of that. So what do children do when they're doing that? They, of course, learn how to problem solve. They learn very effectively how to read the mind of another child. Because if they're free playing and one child starts feeling left out, hurt, not wanting to continue, you'd better be good at reading that child's mind if you want the game to continue, because you're going to have to do something to keep that child in the game. You cannot just continue, because then your free play, your game that you're enjoying will end. And so you have to learn to read the minds of others. You have to learn a different kind of empathy, that there are different types of children with different kinds of levels of sensitivity, different levels of coping with difficulties in the game. And that's where children learn that. And I know this is going to be a leap, and maybe for the politician in the room, but surely that's what politics should be about. It should be about learning to cooperate, reading the mind of the other. And if ever, we're moving further and further away from that in this sort of outraged machine, fracturing, and everybody is fighting with the other, and we haven't learned. We don't have the rules themselves aren't working. And I'm not saying this because we didn't free play. I'm not making that, but I'm saying there might be a link there. Michael Chabot is an American writer, and and I've made a bit of the point already, but he made the point about children roaming. And he argues that without his ability as a child to roam, to explore, he wrote this in a short essay in that book. He also writes quite interestingly about fatherhood and motherhood in that book. But he makes the case of how important this roaming is and this free play in terms of his creative development. And this is a recent article from The Atlantic called The Joyful Illiterate Kindergarten of Finland. So until very recently, I can't give you a date, it was illegal in Finnish preschools to teach literacy. Not discouraged, illegal. They've now changed that, so if the child asks for it, the teacher's allowed to facilitate it. All right. And so if you test English kids at age 5 who are reading very proficiently, they're way ahead of Finnish kids. By age 10, the Finnish kids are completely caught up. By age 12, they're in a different league to the English kids. Okay, we are again teaching our children literacy in a very narrow cognitive kind of manner to sort of achieve a very particular goal later, which I'm afraid the robots are going to be able to do better. In 10 or 20 years' time, the skills that we think are useful, whatever else happens with the robots and AI, they will be able to do that better than us. But what they're not going to be able to do better than us is the socio-emotional stuff, is the curiosity, is the creativity that might be the thing that solves part of or allows us to solve some of the climate breakdown problems. It's not going to be what our schools are currently teaching. I'm currently doing a set of interviews for Grand Challenges Canada. I've been interviewing people, and I spoke to somebody who worked for the World Bank, now works in Latin America. And he said, imagine if the medical profession was like the education system. He says, you know what would happen? He said, we'd all be dead. Because no doctor is still using methods developed in the 19th century. No doctor, I mean, unless it worked back then. But it's changed, it's updated all the time. We would all be dead. And most of our education systems, I'm afraid, come from the 19th 19th century and the early 20th century. They have not adapted to our current world, and they are absolutely not, I have no shadow of a doubt, preparing our children for what's going to happen in 10 years' time. And so if we don't do something differently, we are, as we did with COVID, we're going to throw children under the train. Children took the biggest developmental hit with COVID because we threw them under the train. And so some of the thoughts I've had from these two lovely papers, I just thought I'd put it up there. And so when I think of paradigm shifts, so hopefully I've made some of the case for some of those paradigm shifts. One of them might be, and I was speaking to Paul about this the other day, or last night, and I said this at a conference in Johannesburg a number of months ago, and I was met with laughter, derision, that blew my credibility. But what happens if we gave children of 12 the vote? What would happen? When you say that, people say, yeah, but what about their capacity? They don't have the capacity to vote. Well, I'm afraid you can't use that argument, because if you use that argument, that does mean that you then have to say there's an upper limit. Would it be 70? Or would you have to interview people, do cognitive tests to see if they've got dementia? You can't have it both ways. You can't say capacity is the issue and then allow people who 92 and don't remember their name to vote. And I'm certainly not suggesting they should not vote, but there's a problem. And then all the other arguments that people come up with, I've never heard one that wasn't used to stop women from voting 100 years ago. Not one. Children will just vote what their parents tell them to do. Well, that's exactly what was done when they try to give women the vote. No, they'll just vote what their husbands tell them to do. So every argument is, and so if we want to do if we want to think about something differently, if we want a paradigm shift, because what would happen is that we would all have to learn how to talk to children in different kinds of ways. We would have to learn to speak to them in different ways, and most importantly, political leaders would have to learn how to talk to children, because they would be a particular kind of constituency. So I think that would be a really good start. I also think this is another interesting UNICEF document, largely written by someone called Dominic Richardson, who's now left UNICEF and moved to another think tank, I think, and talks about these core capacities for living and learning. And this is obviously directed about children. This is UNICEF. This is a children's document. But I can't see anything there that's not something that would be a good idea for all of us to live by. I think that when children play, they start learning some of those things. They learn embodiment. They learn, as I said, how to empathize. You learn how to listen and observe and also reflect. And I think if you take that analogy of the spotlight and the analogy of that lantern, I think we've gone too much to the spotlight. We're not allowing ourselves much more of this type of learning in the world. I'm an academic. I've spent most of my career studying kind of research things using randomized controlled trials. And I've done a lot of work in mental health. And one of the mistakes I think we've made in mental health research is that what we've done is we went and developed a whole lot of tools. One of them, for example, the PHQ-9, the screening tool for depression, for depressed mood, or the EPDS. We developed these screening tools, and we found out that they were relatively, valid and reliable, and enough to make the journals happy. And then we made a crucial mistake, is we then thought that that's the important thing to measure, not the other way around. We've forgotten. I did my PhD on attachment, and I suddenly realized it was an eye-opening moment a number of years ago, where I've been working in child and adolescent mental health and doing a lot of work in adolescents. We have a project called # in Nepal and in South Africa around schoolwork with adolescents and mental health. I suddenly realized that over the previous 5 years, I couldn't remember, and it's not like it's not there, but I couldn't remember having read, I certainly hadn't written the word belonging once in 5 years. How can you talk about adolescence without talking about belonging. And the academic community, or the community that I work in, we've forgotten that because we don't have a neat little valid, reliable measure necessarily of belonging. And so we've started to measure, and again, that spotlight, I also put that image there. There's that famous analogy of a person like at night at a searchlight looking, and someone walks up, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Well, I've lost my car keys. I'm looking for my car keys." And they said, but you're only looking there. He says, "Yeah, but this is where the light is." And that's what we've been doing. We're not measuring the right things. And it's not like there aren't people trying. But I think we need to be better at thinking about, in our interventions, in what we measure, words like belonging, kindness, gratitude. Right now, I would argue, and I'm happy to be pushed back on this, but that in adolescence, if you wanted to think about two key things for them, I think one would be belonging, and another is hope. I don't think adolescent young people today, and even younger and younger children, have a whole lot of hope for the future because they see these robots as taking over their jobs. They're desperately worried about climate breakdown. But then we develop an intervention that's around cognitive behavior therapy. And I'm not trashing CBT. Of course, it's important. But it's not speaking to something deeper inside of them. And I think we have to make the shift. And I think communities like this are utterly central in that, because you do, if you work with play, you do use words like joy, because you can't watch a child playing without knowing about joy. So the words are there, but we don't measure them. And there is a bit of the tyranny of academia where we hold the power, and actually people on the ground who are doing the work who know it's about joy and exploration and freedom. But if it's not shown in our RCT, well, then it doesn't count. So you have to stand up, and you have to argue and fight for the joy, for the mattering. If you don't matter, my first job was working in a children's home, in a child and youth care center, a residential center in a small group home, working with 5 very troubled adolescents. And one of my mentors at the time said, what a child needs, is the key thing that a child needs, is they need at least one adult to completely adore them without, with no reservations, with no conditions. And he never used the word mattering, but that's what this is about. It's about also, it's these kinds of words. And if we can't measure them, well, then we must. Okay, perfect. I'm actually about to be done. And so I'm going to end with this quote from David Graeber. The ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something we make. Where we are right now is not the natural order of things. Okay, we've made this, and because we made it, we can just as easily make it differently. I think one of the things we tried to argue in that Lancet Commission was that when you put children at the center of everything, that you then see them as more than just, and somebody said this to me in one of my interviews, children don't get onto policy generally, and this was speaking about low middle income countries, is because they're useless. They're waiting to become something. They're waiting to become economically productive. We're educating them to become valuable members and economically productive members of society sometime in the future. And actually they're not. Where they are right now is really important. They're not useless, and we have to see them differently. And I do think, and this is maybe I'm going full circle. When I was 18, I was an activist in apartheid South Africa. Then I became a boring academic, and maybe now I'm trying to make that full circle, and the idealism of it. But these crises are going to force us, and so here's the moment where we do need to act and change this world and do it differently. Thank you.